Denver International Airport has 54 square miles of land to grow into. Chicago O'Hare has almost none left. So Chicago is spending $12.1 billion trying to buy, in concrete and steel, the one thing Denver already has for free: room. That number started at $8.5 billion in 2018. It has grown by nearly $4 billion since, and the program still isn't finished. Denver didn't earn its land advantage through some brilliant decision. It was built on the largest airport footprint in North America, out where the prairie still had space to give. O'Hare is boxed in by 60 years of surrounding development, so every new gate and every extra concourse has to be squeezed, stacked, or rebuilt inside a footprint that stopped growing decades ago. This is what it costs one airport to buy back an advantage its rival was handed for free. Go back to 1995, and neither of these airports looked like a bet worth making. Denver International had just opened, 16 months late, and $4.8 billion over its original budget, best known nationally for an automated baggage system that tore luggage apart on live television and never fully worked. Reporters called it a boondoggle. Politicians called it worse. What almost nobody said out loud at the time was the one decision that would matter more than any of it. Denver's planners had bought roughly 54 square miles of land out on the Eastern Plains, an area larger than the island of Manhattan, when land that far from the city was still cheap enough to buy in bulk. Nobody was praising that decision in 1995. There was nothing to praise yet. It just sat there, mostly empty, while the airport limped through its first embarrassing years. O'Hare, meanwhile, wasn't limping. It had been the busiest airport on Earth for most of 3.5 decades, the anchor of American and United's Midwest operations, the physical proof that Chicago mattered to the rest of the country's air traffic. But O'Hare had made its own decision back in the 1950s and 60s, one nobody thought to question at the time either. Build it close to the city, close to the highways, close to the workforce. That decision made O'Hare enormously convenient for exactly as long as Chicago's suburbs stayed small enough to leave room around it. They didn't stay small. Subdivisions, warehouses, and highway interchanges filled in the open land around the airport for decades, the way suburban growth fills in around any convenient airport, until there was effectively nowhere left for O'Hare to expand into without buying out entire neighborhoods first. By the 2020s, the two airports' original bets had fully flipped in value. Denver's empty prairie, once a punchline, had become the single largest advantage any American airport owns: room nobody else can touch. O'Hare's convenient, close-in location, once the whole point, had become a permanent ceiling on how big the airport could ever get without paying to remove what was already there. That's the part of this story that doesn't show up in a press release. Land isn't just where the runways sit. It sets the land and the ceiling on everything an airport can do next. How many gates it can add, how many parallel runways it can run at once, whether a new terminal is even physically possible or requires demolishing something else first. Denver can add a runway by paving open ground. O'Hare has to acquire it if it can be acquired at all, or build vertically and underground instead, which costs dramatically more per square foot than building outward ever does. This is the ceiling that makes O'Hare's spending decisions look so different from Denver's, long before either airline ever picks a gate assignment. If it can be acquired at all isn't a hedge. O'Hare has already tested exactly how far that acquisition can go, and the answer involved a cemetery. To build Runway 10 Center in the 2000s, Chicago needed land occupied by St. Johannes Cemetery in nearby Bensonville, a burial ground with its first grave dating back to 1849. Families fought the relocation all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled in the city's favor. Chicago went on to relocate roughly 1,000 graves and level about 500 homes nearby, invoking eminent domain to do it at a relocation cost of $17 million for the cemetery alone. That's what acquiring land actually means once an airport runs out of the empty kind. Denver has never had to fight a state Supreme Court to get a runway built. It just paves the next section of prairie it already owns. Chicago's answer to that ceiling is what's actually called the O'Hare 21st Century Program, a modernization plan the city approved in 2018 at an estimated $8.5 billion. It included a new runway configuration to let more planes land and take off at once, a global terminal meant to replace the airport's aging original terminal, and new concourses stitched onto whatever gaps in the footprint the airport could still find. By the mid-2020s, that $8.5 billion estimate had climbed to roughly $12.1 billion, driven by inflation, pandemic-era supply disruption, and the sheer difficulty of building anything at a hub that never stops operating while the construction happens around it. City officials have since found about $1.5 billion in savings to try to keep the number from climbing further. Run that math, and the program still sits close to $10.6 billion, well above where it started, with years of construction still ahead. The single clearest piece of that program is Concourse D, and it's worth slowing down on the actual numbers instead of the press release version. Chicago locked in a guaranteed maximum price of $1.455 billion for a 19-gate concourse, 580,000 square feet, breaking ground in 2025 and scheduled to open in late 2028. That's not a rough estimate. It's a contracted price ceiling the city negotiated specifically because O'Hare projects keep running over, and it still comes out to roughly $76 million per gate before a single passenger walks through it. Denver's Concourse C expansion, built on land the airport already owned outright, has never needed a guaranteed maximum price contract to keep its budget from drifting, because there was no adjacent demolition, no rerouted taxiway, and no decades-old footprint boundary to design around in the first place. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who notices when two numbers that should track together don't. If that's you, subscribing means you'll catch the next one of these the moment it's out. Concourse D is only the leading piece of a larger $8.2 billion program called Next, which still has a new Concourse E and an entirely new global terminal to build before this modernization era is even finished, plus roughly $300 million in cooling, utility, and pavement work just to keep the existing footprint operating while all of it happens around it. The global terminal piece alone has already climbed from an initial $6.1 billion to somewhere north of $7 billion before the first steel goes up, the same inflation and constraint pattern repeating inside its own sub-project. That full build-out, once expected to wrap by the early 2030s, has already slipped to a target completion date of 2034, an 11 years and counting construction runway on a single active hub. Denver has never needed anything close to that kind of multi-decade sequencing, because it was never squeezed into building one piece at a time around an airport that can't stop operating. None of that spending buys O'Hare a single additional acre. It buys density, more terminal built more cleverly onto the same footprint, more gates squeezed into a perimeter that reached its edge decades ago. That's the trade every landlocked airport eventually has to make, and it's an expensive one. Building outward onto open land costs a fraction per usable square foot of building upward or underground into a footprint that's already full. O'Hare doesn't have the option to build outward anymore, so O'Hare pays the upward and underground price on nearly every project for as long as the airport exists at its current site. Denver, meanwhile, has spent its own money too, just on a completely different kind of project. New gates on Concourse C for Southwest, an expanded international arrivals facility, an ongoing renovation of the Great Hall at the center of the original terminal. But every one of those projects gets built onto land Denver already owns and never had to negotiate for, acquire, or demolish anything to reach. When Denver decided it needed more gates, it built more gates on ground that was sitting there waiting. When Chicago decided it needed more gates, it had to figure out where an additional gate could physically go inside a boundary that stopped expanding when Reagan was still in his first term. Denver's own most expensive project didn't stay disciplined either, and it's worth being straight about that. The Great Hall renovation was originally budgeted at $770 million and has since grown to more than $2 billion, nearly 3 times its original number, with completion now targeted for late 2027. That overrun has nothing to do with land. Denver has plenty of it. It comes down to the ordinary difficulty of renovating a working terminal without shutting it down. The same kind of problem that hits any airport, landlocked or not. Having room to grow doesn't make every project run clean. It just means the growing itself doesn't require buying back the ground first. Run the counterfactual and the gap gets even starker. Denver assembled its 54 square miles in the 1980s, largely undeveloped farmland on the eastern plains, at agricultural land prices. Try to assemble that same 54 square miles today next to a major metro area, and you are not buying farmland anymore. You are buying out subdivisions, warehouses, and the businesses that grew up around a major airport over 40 years, the exact position O'Hare has been stuck in since Chicago's suburbs closed in around it. Denver did not just get lucky with geography, it got lucky with timing, buying its ceiling room before the ceiling had a market price. That window closes for good the moment a city grows up around an airport, and it is already closed at O'Hare. United Airlines has treated the two hubs very differently as a result, and the airline's own numbers say more than any city press release does. Since 2021, United has invested close to $1 billion specifically at Denver, building out 90 gates, the most of any airline at any single American airport, and adding 22 international destinations, including a new non-stop to Rome. United itself calls Denver its fastest growing hub, a characterization built on more than 550 average daily departures and a decade of uncontested room to keep expanding. That's not United bragging into a void. It's an airline responding rationally to which of its two biggest Midwest adjacent hubs actually has room left to build into. At O'Hare, United's expansion options look completely different, constrained less by ambition than by physical geography. Adding meaningful capacity at O'Hare doesn't mean paving open ground the way it does in Denver. It means winning a negotiation over gates that already exist, competing with American Airlines for space inside a terminal footprint that can't get any bigger, or waiting years for a modernization project like the 21st Century Program to physically create new capacity at a far higher construction cost per square foot than Denver pays to do the same thing on open prairie. United isn't the only airline that has noticed how differently the math works in Denver. Southwest runs its single largest operation anywhere out of Denver, leasing 40 gates on Concourse C, more gates than it leases at any other airport it serves, supporting roughly 240 average daily flights to destinations across the country and into Mexico and Central America. Frontier Airlines is headquartered in Denver outright and has expanded around the same open land. 3 separate airlines have independently reached the same conclusion about the same piece of ground. When the constraint that normally limits an airline's ambition, gate space, simply isn't there, airlines build as much as they can justify. O'Hare has never offered any airline that kind of blank check, because O'Hare ran out of blank space first. Put a number on what that actually means, and the gap gets uncomfortable. A new gate at an airport with open land to build on costs primarily the price of the gate itself. Jet bridge, apron, the utilities to run it. A new gate at a landlocked airport like O'Hare often means demolishing something first, rerouting utilities that were never designed to move, or building the structure to hold the gate several stories up instead of at ground level before the gate itself gets built at all. Multiply that difference across dozens of gates over a multi-decade modernization program, and the gap between paving open ground and manufacturing space that doesn't exist is most of the nearly $4 billion overrun sitting inside O'Hare's own budget today. Here's the number that makes the actual gap concrete. Denver's total land area is 54 square miles. O'Hare's is roughly 7,000 acres, a little under 11 square miles, once you account for the terminal complex, the runways, and every support facility the airport actually operates. Denver isn't just bigger. Denver has, conservatively, about 5 times O'Hare's entire footprint, most of it still undeveloped. sitting there as pure future capacity that costs the airport nothing extra to eventually build on. O'Hare has effectively none of that in reserve. Every square foot inside its boundary is already doing a job. If that 5-to-1 gap surprised you as much as it surprised us when we pulled the numbers, send this to someone who's flown through both airports and let them guess which one has more room to spare. O'Hare isn't the only major American hub stuck behind this exact wall, and looking at the other two makes the just build your way out of it argument harder to accept at face value. LaGuardia sits on land bounded by water on multiple sides, so tight that its own runway geometry effectively limits it to one usable runway during peak hours, despite having two on paper. Reagan National operates on a runway just 5,200 feet long, roughly a third shorter than what most major hubs consider standard, because there has never been room to extend it. Both airports, like O'Hare, are federally slot controlled specifically because there's no physical way to expand capacity to meet demand the way an open land airport can. But LaGuardia also spent the better part of a decade proving a landlocked airport isn't automatically stuck. A full terminal rebuild, completed without adding a single acre, replaced some of the worst rated infrastructure in the country with new concourses built entirely within the airport's existing immovable footprint. So, which is it? Is a landlocked hub like O'Hare permanently capped by the ground it sits on, the way LaGuardia was for 60 years? Or is that ceiling just a more expensive problem to engineer around, the way LaGuardia eventually did? Tell us which side of that argument you land on, and which airport you think proves it next. That gap also explains something else that looks on the surface like pure coincidence: O'Hare's own weather problem. A 10-year study published by the Weather Channel in November 2025 ranked O'Hare first among major American airports for weather-related delays, averaging more than 25,000 a year. Some of that comes down to Midwest weather systems that simply hit Chicago harder than they hit Denver. But one widely cited explanation also points to geometry. A tightly packed airfield, built to fit inside a boundary that stopped expanding, has less room to reroute traffic around a storm than an airfield with runways spaced far enough apart to keep operating through weather that would otherwise cascade into hours of delay. Denver was built with 6 widely spaced runways, spaced that far apart because the land was there to do it. O'Hare was not, because the land to do that was never available in the first place. The Weather Channel's own study measures the delay counts, not the runway geometry directly, so treat the spacing explanation as the leading theory, not a settled verdict. None of this means O'Hare is finished, or that Chicago made the wrong decision in the 1960s. O'Hare remains the most connected airport in the country by a wide margin, with well over 200 domestic destinations on its busiest days and among the largest international networks of any American hub. Being close to the city for 60 years was a genuine competitive advantage, not a mistake, and it's the reason O'Hare became the airport that mattered in the first place. What's changed is simpler than a rise and fall story. The thing that made O'Hare valuable in 1965 is the exact thing capping how much bigger it can ever get in 2026. While the thing that made Denver a punchline in 1995 has quietly become the reason it doesn't have to spend $12 billion to keep growing. That's the actual trade hiding underneath every modernization headline. It isn't that Chicago mismanaged anything, or that Denver planned brilliantly 30 years ahead of everyone else. It's that one airport is now paying, dollar for dollar, for an advantage the other one already owns outright. $12.1 billion doesn't buy O'Hare more land. It buys O'Hare a more expensive version of the room Denver was simply sitting on the whole time. If a landlocked hub's only path forward is an ever more expensive rebuild, and an open one just keeps paving new ground for free, that's not really two airports racing each other. It's one airport spinning its way toward a ceiling the other one never had, one gate at a time.